Good day to you from New York, from Columbia Business School, from the Columbia Institute for Television. My name is Dr. Leon Perlman, and I want to welcome you to yet another of the webinar series from the DFS Observatory at Columbia Business School, CITI. Our presenter today is Mr. Costa Peric of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We're going to talk about a very interesting initiative from the foundation called Level 1. So just some housekeeping notes. Please keep your microphone off and video, please. This is just to stop any feedback or ambient noise that might disturb the participants and presenter. And please don't ask any questions by audio at any time. There will be an opportunity to send questions towards the end of the presentation to the moderator host via the chat box. And you'll see the moderator is Michael Weschler. You should see him on the chat screen. You can actually start sending questions towards the end. And we'll collate the questions for Mr. Peric. So today's agenda, it's a 1-hour total commitment to time if you're not doing the quiz. With just a quick introduction to the observatory and to Costa, then the live webinar. Again, send questions to the moderator, the host. No audio at the end of the presentation. Then we're going to do 2 quick polls for about 45 seconds, and then we're going to have a live 15-minute Q&A. And for regular participants, you'll know that there's an optional live quiz. If you didn't, it's a 10-question multiple-choice quiz just after the Q&A ends. And look out for the quiz link in your email and check your spam folders. It's only live for 2 hours for certificate purposes. And after 2 hours, the quiz results will not count for certificate purposes. So please look out for that. So a bit about the observatory. We been funded by the foundation and been around since last year, so relatively new. This is the DFS webinar team behind the scenes. Professor Eli Noam, he's the head of CITI. Again, I'm Dr. Leon Perlman, I'm the head of the DFSO. Mike Weschler is the technical guru and also research scholar at the DFSO and the webinar moderator to send the questions to. And we also have Jason Backwhite, who's the director at CITI. So a bit of our activities. We have a database which you can go see, a legal and regulatory database online. Model laws and regulations. We have an annual summit, very successful 2-day affair. Webinars, these are growing in popularity. Some roundtables, one coming up in November on de-risking. Some publications and commentaries and analysis of new laws and regulations. And we're very involved in the DFS community around the world. And collaborate with SSBs, regulators, academics, and donors. So a bit about our webinars coming up. You'll see that coming up on October 10th is Competition Aspects of Digital Financial Services, Introduction to Paper Technology on October 19th, October 26th, RegTech and Using Financial Inclusion, and November 8th, de-risking the impact on financial inclusion. We're also planning one on November 22nd on infrastructure, security, and DFS. So just to say something about the webinar participation, as I said, this is growing in popularity, and you'll see a poll question reflects that, because what we found is that a number of people are participating in the webinar in a room. So up to 20 people are watching the webinar at one time in one location. So we've got a poll at the end of the presentation. So whoever's in the room, please just go to your computer. If you're out of 20, just one person go and participate in the poll, please. We'd really appreciate that. Okay, a bit about the certificate. Again, attend 6 webinars, and you need to get 60% for each post-webinar live quiz. Again, if you participate in the webinar, you'll be able to pass the test quite well, but you have to concentrate on the slides, not necessarily what's said. You have to concentrate on the written aspects of the presentation. So on to Costa. He's going to talk about the overview of the Level 1 platform. And Costa is the Deputy Director of Financial Services for the Poor Division at the Gates Foundation. He leads a team that focuses on financial inclusion and digital payments, where he oversees the strategy and grants to deliver secure, reliable, and affordable financial inclusion. He's also co-founder and leader of InnoTribe, a SWIFT initiative to enable collaborative innovation in the financial industry. He's also was also the chief architect of SwiftNet, and he's also the author of The Castle in the Sandbox, and there's his Twitter address. So handing over to you, Costa, in Brussels.
Thank you very much, Leon. Indeed, hello to everyone from sunny Brussels today, which is great. And let us talk about the Level 1 project. So I'm going to concentrate today on describing to you what is Level 1 project, and essentially get you the vision behind it, the details, some details about the actual principles it is based on, aspects of deployment of Level 1 project in the countries, very short glimpse of economics, and then a little bit about our regional work. So let's dive in right away. So before we actually describe Level 1 project, let me draw the big picture context for you about payment systems. And this particular chart here, which is sourced from SWIFT, shows a classification of payment systems depending on two factors: time criticality of payments and the size of payments, meaning the value of the payments. So on the size, we have low value, high value payments, and on the time criticality, we have batch payments in batches and single payments. So to walk you through this, if we look at payment batches for low value, this is typically in financial systems done by so-called ACHs, automated clearing houses. At the opposite side of the spectrum, where we have high-value single payments, typically interbank, they are done through an infrastructure called RTGS, real-time gross settlement. The topic we will talk today about is really about single payments, low value, which is in fact the target segment of financial inclusion efforts, of course, because we are talking about very low value payments done all the time in real time. And so this segment is the segment of real-time retail payment systems, and Level 1 project is positioned in that particular segment. In formulating the Level 1 project principles, we have looked and consulted a number of stakeholders that are active in this segment, notably, for example, the UK's Faster Payment Scheme, Canada's Interact Scheme, Mexico's Pay, Peru's BIM. So Level 1 project, as you will see, is really a kind of like concentrate of good practices that we have formulated in a way that is adapted and adequate to serve very poor people in remote locations in Africa and Asia. So what is the Level 1 project? And we tend to abbreviate it with this acronym L1P. Very often by abbreviation, we talk about Level 1 too. But first of all, why is it called Level 1 project? It's actually the composition of three ideas. Level is level playing field. You will see that Level 1 project is all about interoperability and federating financial service provider in a level playing interoperable field. One stands for one economy that serves everyone, benefits everyone, which is very much related to financial inclusion. And project conveys the meaning of finite in time. So this is not something that will last forever. We want this to be a very concentrated effort and to essentially get it behind us by connecting the 2 billion people estimated today that are unbanked. So Level 1 project, first of all, is, as I mentioned, it's envisioning a digital payment platform. First of all, that is interoperable and that therefore federates financial service providers, either existing ones like banks, but also new ones like mobile money operators and other digital financial service providers in a single, seamlessly interoperable system. And it is based on design principles. So we will talk about this principle in a second. The second thing that Level 1 project is kind of like a blueprint of how a system with these characteristics can be configured and operated within a country or a region. We will see that the most efficient from the financial inclusion perspective deployment of real-time payment platforms aligned with Level 1 project is really at a country level. That's the most impactful, but we'll see towards the end of the presentation that also we have efforts going on regional level in Africa, for example. And then the third thing that Level 1 project is, it's a set of tools and resources that the Gates Foundation publishes on a global good basis. Assets and resources that are available on the level1project.org website. Any and every learning and document that we ever publish is available to everyone for use. Our intent really by doing this is that essentially any country or community in any region can embark on digital financial inclusion without necessarily needing a lot of help from outside. So ultimately, we hope that these principles and assets will be available and that many people will use it on their own without necessarily requiring specific help from the foundations and partners. Here we can see in a graphical form and short form how this payment platform looks like. And as you can see, the first apparent characteristic of it is that it stands in the middle of several key systems. On the left-hand side, we see, of course, the incumbent banking industry with the bank accounts, which is, of course, present in many of the countries where we work, but that does not provide yet financially inclusive solutions. On the right-hand side, we see the mobile money wallet platforms that are numerous and quite pervasive in Africa and some countries in Asia. And today, many of these mobile money platforms are non-interoperable. So while they provide benefits on their own, like, for example, M-Pesa in Kenya or bKash in Bangladesh, ultimately, if we want to achieve full financial inclusion, we will need to interconnect these mobile money systems between themselves and to connect them to the bank accounts as well. Because essentially and mathematically, a single provider, however powerful they are, will never manage to include 100% of the population. As well, what we try to achieve by interconnecting all of these systems together is to provide choice and competition because one of the key factors, of course, of the acceptability of payment platforms by the poor is, of course, the cost of using them and the accessibility. So these are the two key stakeholders, but certainly not all of them. On the top side of the picture, we see a number of institutional payors or payees that are very important in this picture. Governments in many countries in Africa and Asia are the source of numerous payments, notably, of course, salaries and pensions, but also many social support programs across Africa and Asia. And as such, so governments are a huge payor, and digitizing and onboarding these payments is hugely beneficial and is a huge bootstrap to digital payment platform economies, because it provides essentially the input of money into digital form. On the other side, we have schools and utilities, which are the destination of numerous regular payments for school fees and for, of course, utility payments such as electricity. So connecting these stakeholders on the platform is going to be hugely beneficial. Last, but certainly not least, once the money is in digital form in the platform, it's necessary to be able also to spend it digitally. And this is where the merchants come in. It's very important to be able to use money in digital form. Our vision of success of financial inclusion is that money becomes and stays digital as much as possible, as opposed to scenarios like over the counter, where money becomes digital for a few minutes before being cashed out immediately. So this picture shows the overall ecosystem that Level 1 project seeks to interconnect. Let us now dive into the principles that we have enumerated and collected that will make such a system adapted and adequate to serve the poor. The first one we have already mentioned, I have already mentioned several times. It's called open loop system. It, of course, it allows interoperability. So it's very important, as I mentioned, that all financial service providers be interconnected, because that's the only way we will be able to reach the poor in rural areas by connecting the players who serve these people into the system. That's the open loop system, as I mentioned, is also important to provide choice and variety of services, because not even though the poor segment, the poor in this segment are poor, they have numerous needs. So this segment of the poor is actually quite varied and quite diverse, and it's important to be able to gather for all of these needs by connecting adequate financial service providers into the system. The second set of principles talks about the nature of payments themselves. And we talk there about real-time or near real-time payments, push payments, and irrevocable payments. So let me explain each of these terms in sequence. Real-time, of course, that means that across this system, from the user perspective, payments are settled immediately. If I'm a poor person purchasing something at a merchant, my account or mobile money wallet is debited immediately, the merchant account is credited immediately, the transaction is irrevocable and cannot be undone in the system. It can be, of course, undone by negotiating outside of the system, but from the system's perspective, the payment is irrevocable. That the reason for irrevocability is essentially to keep the cost of the system down. As I have mentioned, it's the economics and the cost to the user is very important. If we want poor people to use it, the cost has to be zero or near zero, and therefore keeping the cost down of the level 1 project aligned system is very important. Irrevocability provides a huge advance in this way. Real time, of course, has to do with the needs of the poor, and as in many use cases, we are essentially replacing cash. Therefore, the transaction has to be real time. Otherwise, people would simply not trust it and would not use it. Finally, and this requires perhaps a little bit more explanation, the push payments. So push payments essentially mean volunteered payments. So me as a payee, I volunteer the payments to the vendor or merchant or counterparty, as opposed to scenarios which perhaps in the Western world were used, where the merchant or vendor would request my information and then would directly interact with my bank to get the money out of my account. This is very cumbersome. This implies sharing a lot of information and is subject to many cases of fraud. Push payments, where a person essentially volunteers the amount and the account where it comes from, are much more efficient and resistant to fraud. The next set of principles has to do with the governance and settlement in the system. The notion of settlement between providers is very important. As we mentioned, while transactions are settled immediately between users, of course, if these users are served by different providers, then of course the providers themselves have to settle in the banking system, in the underlying banking system. So the principle says that settlements between providers should be same day, or actually, if possible, even faster than same day. The reason for this principle is that as we have numerous new players that will come into the system to serve the poor, we don't want the system's risk to increase by allowing inter-provider settlements and therefore net positions to grow too much. That would expose the overall system to a huge risk. So same-day settlement is one principle, but in fact, we have seen, like, for example, the space system in Mexico settles between providers every couple of seconds, actually. It's 5-6 seconds, which is much better and reduces the risk of the overall system. The next principle is about governance. So it is important that there is a collaborative environment between the providers where the governance and who can do what and who can participate is actually governed by the participants. This creates a feeling of fairness among the participants. It's a quite important and somewhat tricky principle to implement. If you think about, for example, banking communities and telco communities, they may not necessarily want to work together. So this principle is not to be neglected. The next one has to do with cost recovery. So if there is an interoperable platform serving all of these players, we deem that the platform is not something that is run on a for-profit basis, but it's really more operated on a cost recovery basis like a utility. So essentially, it's an industry utility serving the industry. Any profit that is generated should be used to enhance the utility and not for distribution to investors or shareholders. Finally, and the most perhaps advanced principle is the shared investment principle that is best illustrated when we talk about fraud. Fraud management in digital financial systems is very important and is also quite tricky to implement. So if we were to impose on all players to do their own fraud management, the system would be as strong as the weakest of these implementations, and the system would be hugely expensive. So we advise that the system should run on a shared investment basis, especially when it applies to fraud detection. So these are the principles underlying Level 1 projects. This is a slide that shows how the components of the Level 1 project. So on the bottom of this slide, in the darker shaded area, we have the traditional incumbent banking system that exists pretty much everywhere. On the top lighter shaded area, we have the Level 1 real-time digital payment system that is focused on serving the poor. So we can see there the key components of in the central box, top box of any Level 1 project system, but one of course has to do with interoperability. Another we have mentioned has to do with fraud and risk management. And then other shared services can be added profitably to this shared utility on an optional basis, but notably agent and merchant account management features are very well served in a shared utility model. We can see, of course, as well that the digital payment system on top also is connected to the banking system on the bottom, simply also because we require interoperability with bank accounts, but also, and perhaps more importantly, because all of the digital payment transactions on the mobile money side need to be settled on between providers using central bank money in the banking system. So what does a Level 1 system look like in reality? Well, as you can see here, these are some servers and a control room. So nothing very special about it, except to say that technology is not the only issue to be solved here. Economics are important, and we'll talk about that in a second. But also operational excellence and security management are going to be very important in these systems if we want to acquire and conserve the trust of the poor to use it. A few words about the collaboration versus competition. I have already talked about this notion of shared infrastructures, and this slide exemplifies where sharing makes sense, where sharing and collaboration make sense, and where it does not, where competition plays. So looking at Level 1, the collaboration is really about the rules and governance applying to the shared collaborative system, and of course the rails, the technology that implements the interoperability and fraud. And as we said, this is better done shared than on a competitive basis. Now, of course, the competition occurs on the account management feature and all of the rich application that we hope will be created on the payment platform. So we see level 1 payment platforms not as the end, but really a key milestone to enable a rich set of account management and applications that are diverse and that cater for many diverse needs of the poor. We talk here about solar, leasing solar batteries, loans, insurances, and many other applications that we hope will be created, and perhaps the next Uber in the digital financial inclusion space. Let's talk a little bit about the economics of setting up a level 1 real-time system. So here we have a quick glimpse on these economics. Of course, there is the setup cost to set up this, and then there are the operation and maintenance costs. So these figures are quite important because as the collaborative effort between commercial providers go on, of course, the economics of the shared infrastructure will take into account these necessary spending in order to achieve scale and interoperability. So I will not delve into this in much detail. It's a whole subject in itself, and we have numerous studies that go into many more details, but keep in mind for now that the setup cost is typically between $5 to $20 million, depending on the complexity of the endeavor, of course, and that the operation maintenance costs typically are 20% of the setup. So that gives you an indication of the setup costs of these real-time payment platforms. I wanted to show you this slide. This is illustrating, in fact, the economics of shared platforms. And this particular slide shows you it comes from Swift, and it shows two curves of actual observed costs per message and volume of messages on the Swift network from 91 to 2015. So you can see how the traffic has and still is exponentially growing over time. And you can see as a result, the unit cost of messaging, which is illustrated, in fact, by Swift's price to the users of the Swift network, how that costs, marginal cost of a message goes down in proportion to the scale. And so this slide captures very much the economics of real-time shared payment platforms, and it shows that the key important factor for sustainability of such platforms is really the scale and volume on the growth. And so remember, when I was talking about government payments and merchant payments, these are going to be important factors in growing the scale on the payment platform. And so, as I was mentioning, this relatively complex slide from McKinsey shows how people can calculate the break-even point of a shared payment platform as the volume grows. So you can see the various comments and scenarios. I don't have the time again to go into this in much detail, but I'll leave you with this picture and with the fact that there is much more research and studies done behind this. Just kind of stepping back from financial inclusion for a second, we can observe as well that the demand for real-time payment systems is actually growing around the planet. The pioneers, as I mentioned, have been notably UK faster payment. Australia has a huge project going on. Meanwhile, India also has a real-time payment system, and China too. So we can see that the demand for real-time payment systems is growing across the planet. And on the curves on the right-hand side, you can see the curve, the historical curve of the adoption of RTGS systems over time, and we can see how the nascent curve of the real-time payment system is starting to grow, and we expect that it will grow pretty much similarly to the growth of RTGS systems. So this is to say that real-time payment systems are important and probably fundamental for financial inclusion, but that actually these payment systems are beneficial to all economies. Finally, I wanted to, in this last part of the talk, to talk a little bit about regional payment systems. So as you have seen, scale and volume of payments are going to be crucial in the long-term viability and sustainability of these payment platforms. And so naturally, we've been, of course, led to think about how to grow this volume. And one natural way to look at it is, of course, to combine country efforts into regional efforts. And if you look at Africa, Africa is actually, you can see on the left-hand side some statistics about Africa, but Africa is interesting because while there is a large number of countries with a quite different economic and political regimes, nevertheless, there is, and Africa is actually covered by many regional economic and political agreements and communities. And it is a very natural thought to actually grow payment systems beyond countries on a regional basis. Perhaps the most natural, of course, region to look at in this context would be the WAMU, the Western Africa Economic and Monetary Union, which is 8 countries, mostly francophone, which actually share a currency, the CFA. So it's actually very natural to think about growing the digital payment systems that are there, that are currently very siloed, to connect them together and then to connect them together on a regional basis. In SADC, the Southern African Development Community, there are efforts going on now to extend the CIRES system on a multi-currency basis beyond the RAND, and to also connect the CIRES system to digital payment systems and mobile money systems. That's a very interesting development that will also drive growth. Eastern Africa, of course, is the birth country and region of mobile money. And there, the situation is very interesting because there is growing demand for cross-currency, cross-border, real-time, low-value transactions. So there are some studies that tend to also look at the economic viability of interconnecting all of these systems together. So this to say, and we at the Gates Foundation have projects in WAMU in collaboration with the African Development Bank. We are involved with SADC, and we are financing studies about the Eastern African region. And so it's really a story that is unfolding, but I personally believe that not only will this drive further the growth, but perhaps will one day, and this is really my dream, that we we actually achieve a continent-wide interconnected payment platform. This talks a little bit about the efforts, more particularly of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So you can see here the 8 countries that we specifically work in, and the partners that we typically tend to work as well with. As I mentioned, we are growing our efforts in regional approaches as well. So I will not dwell on this slide much further. So in summary, here is what we are trying to achieve in a few words. Everyone benefits from an economy that includes everyone. A recent McKinsey report has looked at the impact on the economies in developing countries if we achieved financial inclusion, and it is an eye-opening report that shows that not only there is a huge opportunity for financial providers to serve the poor, but there is also a huge benefit for the economies and the countries where we work to grow the economies and allow essentially to achieve country-wide benefits while serving also as a poverty alleviation measure. And I will leave you with this one last slide with kind of an optimistic outlook on what we are trying to achieve. Thank you very much. And let's see if there are any questions.
Many thanks, Costa. That was great. I think you gave a very comprehensive overview of the this extremely important project. So again, I just want to remind you that you're listening to a presentation from Costa Peric of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, brought to you by the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation and the DFS Observatory at Columbia Business School. So we're gonna head into questions for Costa. So you'll see a web chat box. Michael Weschler is the host. If you could send your questions to him now, and then we'll collate them and read them out to Costa. So no audio-based questions, please. We're also going to do a poll very shortly. So we're going to ask you what your organization type is and how many people are viewing the webinar. As I said, there are many people who are we found who are viewing the webinars in a room simultaneously. So we're going to bring up the polls very shortly. They should be coming up on the right-hand side of your screen. Okay. Great, there we are. You've got 1 minute about to answer the poll. So if you are in a room full of people, just ask somebody to step out to the computer and answer the polls. We'd appreciate that. And if you can, just send your questions through to the moderator, Michael Weschler. Okay, 15 seconds left. Okay, so first question for Costa from Sunil in Bangalore. Technically, at a platform level, what would you say needs most improvement in systems?
What can you repeat the question, please?
Okay, I'm just collating it. Technically, at a platform level, in a typical TFS platform, what aspects of the platforms that you've seen need most technical improvement that
Okay.
I assume that the level 1 project apply to?
Yeah. I think there are essentially three in my mind. One has to do with the actual switching of payments, and we've done quite some studies, but today the technology there are technologies out there that can tremendously help in the scaling of that and distribution. I think the second domain really has to do with inter-provider settlement, and this is a domain that is very prone to slow and cumbersome operations. So there is a huge potential improvement, including with such high advanced technologies such as blockchain-inspired domains. And then finally, I think there is this whole notion of ID and mapping of IDs between systems that is very important. We know, for example, in India, one way they have solved this is with having a single ID system with Aadhaar, which is very successful. But in other countries, there is no single ID, so mapping techniques between various IDs are going to be very important.
Okay, that actually is a segue because you mentioned blockchain. Prad in Jakarta wants to know what blockchain plays in the DFS payment platform, given the number of central banks who are trialing blockchain for their own purposes.
Yes, so as I mentioned, I think personally that where blockchain makes the most sense is really in this inter-provider settlement. So essentially moving money, going from the current system where essentially the digital payment providers have to instruct the banks to move net positions, and the banks process that within a day, moving to a system that is distributed and where value can move directly, perhaps in central bank money, is, I think, something that is very well adapted to technologies such as blockchain or derived from blockchain. When talking about blockchain, I just want to mention one thing. In level 1, we strive to help deploy systems that are attributable. So we need to comply with country and regional regulations. So we do not advocate for anonymous payment systems such as Bitcoin, but we are very open and I think very encouraged by blockchain-derived technologies that can tremendously help in this domain. And we will publish soon, later in October, in the context of Cybos. The Cybos conference will publish some early results of some detailed discussions on this topic.
Yeah, I think the other wrinkle, of course, is the encryption. A lot of the blockchain systems are US derived, and there are export restrictions on the encryption technology.
Yeah, the main difficulty with blockchain, which we have been working to circumvent, is that blockchain systems tend to assume a single blockchain that is worldwide, which obviously is not adapted to the context of country and regional payment systems, as you say, Leon, because of privacy issues. So we have been looking at how to circumvent that while benefited from the other beneficial characteristics of blockchain, such as scalability, distribution, and crypto-based transactions.
I mean, you made a good point on the blockchain and settlement. I think just to expand on that, some of the blockchains, especially like the R3 Corda, allow you a discrete look at liquidity positions just for their transaction, a bit like what's done, not with blockchain, but certainly in Mexico.
Yeah.
Which means that for interoperability purposes, you don't need to have a huge amount of collateral. You just need to have visible liquidity for purposes of settling the one transaction that you're about to undertake, which improves liquidity positions all around for especially the smaller providers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Jose, interestingly, Jose in Mexico City, and hope everything's okay there in Mexico City, Jose. I know you mentioned governance of a platform, but what role do you think regulators like central banks should play in national payment platforms for DFS? Should there be technical mandates or just principles that need to be applied by the service provider participants in DFS?
Yeah. So I think it can be both. We have seen situations where the central bank does both of the functions that can be envisioned. So one is, of course, driving the creation and of the rules and governance related rules for the payment system itself. And the second possible role is to actually operate the system itself. I think that most central banks will be driven to the first role. We have seen cases, Jordan, for example, in their JAMO Pay system is a good case where the central bank has endorsed the operational role, but for a limited period of time, with the view that the private sector should take that role later on. So there are multiple roles, but I think the key role of the central bank, as they are mostly also the regulator, has to do with setting up and clearing the way for the creation of a real-time payment system, its associated rules and governance.
Okay, thanks, Costa. From Abdul in Cairo, how many countries do you think exactly match the principles of level 1?
So today, I know of 3 systems that are close to all of the principles in level 1. There is the system in Peru that's called BIM. There is a system in Jordan called JAMOPay. And then we are looking into the details of the IMPS and UPI system in India, which implements most of the rules as well. These are the ones we are aware of. Egypt, interestingly, is a very hotbed country for innovation in this. I'm not entirely sure of how it is in detail ongoing, but I know that there is a lot of effort. So we are looking to make a case study in Egypt eventually and see how the things are going on there. But since the person is from Egypt, I wanted to mention that there is a lot of things happening in Egypt right now. But I wouldn't be able to say if it's compliant to aligned with the level 1 principles yet. And then, of course, there are some systems that are deemed faster payment system, notably the UK one. But of course, the UK faster payment system is not accessible from simple mobile phones. So in that way, it's quite different. But some of the principles of level 1 are actually inspired by the UK faster payment system.
Okay. We've got a lot of questions coming through. I don't think we're going to get through all of them because we've got 7 minutes left. From Jeffrey Bauer, I think he's in London. I'm in agreement with all the principles and see the value of shared technology, but as someone who's professionally works to enable collaboration in payments, I'm fully aware that the technology and platform is often the least challenging part of the business development process. Can you talk about how you actually achieve consensus to collaborate that gets the partners to even begin discussing what system they should work together to design?
Yeah, so I agree as well that technology is necessary component, but not sufficient. I think that there is a couple of things that are helping the dynamic of this. First of all, as you all know, there is a now huge emphasis through the UN Global Development Goals for the governments to embark on financial inclusion. So we can see that more and more governments, regulators are taking a more active role and sometimes more directive role in guiding the private sector going on. The second dynamic that is happening, which I see a lot, is also that commercial players are starting to realize that that the market is too fragmented and that there is some interoperability and consolidation needed. And so I can see, and we are invited by private sector players to convene efforts to essentially create shared platforms. As I mentioned, we haven't yet achieved, mixing oil with water, because of course, when you talk about banking communities and telco communities, they are quite different, but we can see very large efforts going on individually in these communities, and then we can see the first signs of actually understanding the need to interoperate on an industry level. So I agree that it is hard, and perhaps one of the biggest roles of organizations like the Gates Foundation, but also AFI and BTCA and the United Nations is probably driving towards that, because that's, I think, the last mile difficulty that we really have. So I wholeheartedly agree that this is hard, but I'm optimistic that economic factors and governmental drive will get us there.
One more question. What does a decent size or scale look like for an emerging market that seeks to implement level 1?
What does decent scale?
Size and scale, yeah.
Size and scale. So I would say that if we have 3 or 4 incumbent financial providers gathering up, I think that's enough. That's enough to get the ball rolling. On the interoperability side of things. So, of course, as you have seen from the economics piece of the equation, it is very important to grow volume very fast for economically sustaining this. And I have seen projections in some projects that we have going that in relatively small countries, that 2 years is something that is achievable in terms of getting to self-sustainability.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Costa. Again,
with great pleasure.
Thank you for all your questions. I think if you, what we'll do is, because I think we've got about 20 more questions that we need to get through, and obviously we're out of time, we'll send them to Costa, and if you've got anything else, send them through to us, and we'll pass them on to Costa, and he can reply later. So thank you again to everybody who participated. We actually have a few hundred people on this webinar, very popular around the world, and invite you to the next webinar, which is October 6th on competition in DFS. And just a reminder to look out for the quiz email regarding this webinar. You have 2 hours.
The quiz email should actually be in the email that was sent out for the webinar.
Thank you, Michael. So you have 2 hours to complete 10 multiple questions. Again, if you've been attentive to Costa's slides, you should get through it quite easily. And we'll see what the results are. So again, thank you for participating, and it's a goodbye to you all around the world from New York City. We'll see you next time.